Hei og velkommen til Kuratorsamtale. Vi her I dag sammen med MaryAnne Stevens, og vi skal snakke om kuratering, om kunst, og ikke minst om den store Astrup-utstillingen som vi åpner på fredag den 15. oktober. MaryAnne Stevens, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
You have curated this exceptional show. And I would like to talk a little bit about you, but before we start, and for the audience, could you please briefly sort of explain the role of a curator in a historic show like this?
Being a curator for a historic show is probably a little bit different from being one with for a contemporary show. It requires a significant amount of knowledge about the artist or the subject before you can even think of doing an exhibition. But also it requires you to imagine what your knowledge of the work of an artist or of a particular movement, whether it's capable of being put into an exhibition form. Because in the end, an exhibition is an argument on the wall, but the paintings have to, or the works of art have to support that argument right the way through, such that they're not just beautiful objects on the wall, although that's very important, of course, because you want the visitor to have an aesthetic experience, a really deep experience of beauty and pleasure to be derived from that. But also it is a kind of learning experience. And I've always said that when a visitor comes to an exhibition, they have to be able, if they want to learn more about the subject than they knew when they started. Now, they may choose not to, and that's fine. That's their choice. But you have to be able to articulate the argument as clearly as possible so that each gallery that the visitor goes into, they can understand, so I see this is what the artist, or this is what this group of artists was trying to say at this moment, or was trying to say about this subject in this particular way. So it is a combination of giving enormous pleasure, but also the capacity for learning more. But that stems from having to have a really deep knowledge of the subject itself. Otherwise, it becomes a kind of postage stamp exercise. You walk through a book and you select 50 works and think, oh yeah, that would look well on the walls. It doesn't work that way.
So ideally, this is an exercise in combining pleasure and learning.
It is absolutely that, and learning on the part of the curator just as much as learning on the part of the visitor.
Well, you are certainly in a position to tell us about curating. You are one of the most prominent curators in the world today. I don't think I said right saying that. You have been curating or been at the Royal Academy for quite a few years and made seminal shows about Astrup before, but also Impressionists. Can you tell us a little bit about your career?
Yes, I started as an academic reading art history and then economics and art history, and then going on to do my master's and research for PhD, and fully expected to be firmly in the academic world. I was given the opportunity to work early on, when I was still in the academic world, on exhibition catalogues for historic shows, as an exercise really in learning how to talk in detail about an individual work of art. It's a very good discipline. And I realized in the process that writing these entries, you also came to understand how an exhibition had been put together. So I became quite intrigued by that, and was asked to get involved in making some exhibitions in now the 1970s. That's eons ago. And then I was given an opportunity by the Royal Academy of Arts, when I was still in the academic world, running an art history department, to curate a major rethink of the last 2 decades of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, in an exhibition called Post-Impressionism. And it was at that point that I realized that all of my research, which was in this area, had thrown up very different questions and had produced very different answers from the standard text of how to talk about French art from 1880 to 1914, for example. And that this was an opportunity to try that out, to try out these alternative routes. Not because I was being intrinsically anarchic, although there's an element of that in me, but really because I did fundamentally believe that you could use exhibitions as a means of opening eyes to different ways of exploring subjects. And I suspect that has been my philosophy or my approach ever since. So every time I have been asked subsequently for the very many exhibitions that I have curated, I would always ask with the first question is there something new I can bring to this subject? So when I was doing my Manet project, of which there have been so many Edouard Manet exhibitions, that you think the subject must have been covered. But actually there was one bit of his output that had never been investigated, which is Manet as a portrait painter. And it seemed to me that, right, so this is something that we can bring to the public eye. I can bring to academics on the one side, to students, but also to the general public. And it's worth doing. And the reason for saying it's worth doing is also because shunting valuable, often slightly fragile works of art around the world, just for the pleasure of putting an exhibition on, cannot just be for pleasure only. It has to really bring something new to the table. And if it does, then you can justify that degree of movement. But if it doesn't, in my mind, there's no point in doing it. It's been done. So another exhibition on another Monet or another whatever. My feeling is that this is just to produce money for income for the institution, but it isn't actually doing anything for either the artist or the students and the public who are going to see these works. And so, in a sense, that's exactly the question I asked about Astrup. There have been many exhibitions on Astrup. So why, me as a non-Norwegian, coming to the subject, did I have anything new to bring that might actually lead to a deeper and broader understanding of the artist for a Norwegian audience and also for a non-Norwegian artist? And in the process of posing that question, I came to the conclusion that yes, I thought it would be possible with working with a team of scholars. I think we could get there. And so that is basically underpins the exhibition which is opening this weekend.
Just out of curiosity, it's a bit of a leap from Paris 1880 to Ulster 1905.
It is and it isn't. I'd already become increasingly interested in what we call Nordic art, because calling it Scandinavia gives it too political or geographic. Nordic is a more useful term. I suppose it was probably 1990s when I was working on an exhibition with the very distinguished, sadly now deceased American art historian Robert Rosenblum, which was called 1900. And it was looking at European artists' responses to the question posed by being in Paris in 1900 for the International Exhibition. And was there just one route for modernism, or were there several options that an artist who, if he was interested or she was interested, could take? And in the process, of course, I was looking at the Nordic countries because they had very strong presence and were, interestingly enough, highly praised by the critics. Their contribution for the 1900 exhibition, whether it was Finland, with Kalangolela's pavilion, also done with Salon and so on, or whether it was Sweden, Norway, which was seen to be much better than its contribution in 1889, I suddenly became intrigued. I thought, there's something I don't know about that I really should know. Because unfortunately, Nordic art, apart from Munch, is just not part of the curriculum for art history in the UK. And so I then got interested in, or was asked to get involved in a Hammershøi exhibition, Willem Hammershøi, Danish, but that really got me deep into what was happening in Nordic art at the beginning of the 20th century. And from there, Astrup came along, because in a way, the challenge of Hammershøi was somewhat similar to the challenge that I was given for Astrup, which was, if we, i.e. the Norwegians, wish to get Astrup better known abroad, outside Norway, how do you tackle that? And that was exactly the question that was posed with Hammershøi, because although there had been an exhibition at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris in 1995, I think it was, which then went to the States, surprisingly, to the Guggenheim, as a result of my kind of telling Robert Rosenblum it should go to the States. Really, he was in terms of the UK, he was completely unknown. So the challenge was, how do you make a British public who is very risk-averse in terms of coming to know artists they've never heard of before? You know, so they don't crowd into those exhibitions. How do you somehow persuade them that here is an artist of great quality that they really ought to be spending time with? And insofar as it succeeded, I then thought, well, how is it that we did this? And I think it was a combination of a very direct story that we were telling, but also the selection of absolutely top quality works, so that nobody going into that exhibition, as I hope with the Astrup they'll do the same, could say, oh, so he's an uneven artist, so I now know why I've never heard of Hammershøi, so I can kind of leave that out of my agenda for the future. And what I wanted them to come away from the exhibition with was, my gosh, every single work I looked at was a masterpiece. And that was, in a sense, I suppose, the approach that I then thought was worth taking with Astrup, because his body of work, if you select carefully, is sufficiently strong to hold its own brilliantly off the walls.
And interestingly, the Astrup show is now traveling. It's coming from the Clark in the United States. It's having a stop here, where is, must be allowed to say, home.
Absolutely.
And then traveling back to, and then traveling to Stockholm in New Year. Mm-hmm. Can you expand a bit on why these shows internationally are important in our understanding of Astrup in an international context and a Nordic context?
Yes, I think he has that importance internationally, or you can make him have that importance internationally by setting yourself a goal of seeing the artist within an international context. Something that struck me very early on when I started working in depth on Astrup was that although he had been very well covered within Norwegian art historical scholarship and exhibitions, he had been very much seen as a Norwegian artist. In contrast to Munch, who was always seen as international because he set out to be that. I mean, where does he show his first major radical show? In Berlin in 1892. Astrup wasn't doing that. He did go international, but that's a different story. I mean, we can talk about that later. But it was, and so I really, in starting my research, I sort of posed the question: not how often did he travel outside Jølster, which is important in itself, but where did he go? What did he see? Why did he go? What was he learning from? And what contact did he have with the art world of the early 20th century, which was an incredibly exciting period of churn and questioning and alternative routes that modernism could take. And I came to the conclusion that Astrup was very internationally minded. He knew exactly what was going on in Berlin, in Paris. When he was in Paris in 1901 too, we know what he went to see, he comments upon them, and you could also extrapolate from that what else he might have seen. So you could begin to build up his his experience in Paris, which was partly exhibitions in commercial galleries, partly these major national group exhibitions like the Salon des Indépendants, for example, where he saw Rousseau, he saw Maurice Denis, he saw other members of the Nabi who are the disciples of Paul Gauguin. He could have seen Cézanne in another exhibition in Paris during the period he was there. Now, he doesn't say he visits them, but they were available. And if he says he's interested in these artists in the Salon des Indépendants, you can think, oh yeah, so if he's interested in those, he's likely to have sussed out these other exhibitions. So you could begin to build a wider context for him, which then allows you to start posing questions of, does that experience have any impact on his own work? And added to that, we know that he had access to Kunst und Kultur from the very moment of its publication, first in 1910, 1911. And through there are regular articles, not just on Norwegian art, but on Nordic art and on non-Nordic art. In other words, what's happening in Paris, what's happening in Berlin, and so on. We know that his friend Hans Jink, the author, with whom he had a very good, very long and important relationship, supplied him with a text by Kandinsky, the founder of abstraction, if you like. And he not only reads this text, and I think it's the treatise that he wrote on abstraction, published in 1911, on concerning the spiritual in art. He poses the question, should I go to Munich? Because I think I ought to interrogate what Kandinsky and his fellow Russians, by that he's referring to Yavlensky in particular, are up to, because it's obviously very interesting. So his eyes are open. And then in 1917, what does he do? But he puts in a subscription for 3 years, it only lasted that, of a really radical periodical coming out of Copenhagen called Klingen. And that's got prints after Picasso, Braque, Matisse, alongside works by the German expressionists. So he's plugged into that international scene, which then increasingly makes you take a different view on his art, rather than thinking to what extent is he recording the Western Norwegian landscape. You're thinking, how is he recording it? And is he showing signs of the impact of his increasing knowledge of and interest in contemporary European movements, proto-expressionism, for example? Is that having any impact on his work? And the conclusion I came to was that it did, but not in a one-to-one sense. In other words, he absolutely understands what Matisse is up to. He critiques Picasso and Cubism. He says in the end he thinks it's too narrow and formulaic. He has doubts about Kandinsky, thinking that Kandinsky did something extraordinary, but then again that becomes formulaic. And what he's doing is basically finding his own route through these various forms of modernism to find his own very distinct, personal, modern voice. And that, I think, is really what I hope this exhibition will show. And it poses the question, had he not died at the age of 47, what would he have gone on to do? Would he have become an abstract artist? I don't know.
But at least in my mind, there's always been this, I wouldn't say schisma, but sort of there is a Norwegian art history which is based on the East Coast, or the coast really, but on Oslo.
Yes.
And then the Norwegian art history is from a West Coast point of view. But you're saying that they are sort of fusing here, and he is not painting the West Coast, but he's seeing the West through the eyes of a modernism.
Well, I think it's two things. I think the choice of the specific, deliberate choice that he took when he returned from Paris in 1902, not to go to Christiania, which after all was the artistic capital of Norway at the time, to be independent Norway, because it's 3 years before your independence, but to come back to Jolster. It was, I think, a very deliberate decision that he felt that he had to return to what he regarded as the source of inspiration for his art. And he embeds himself in Ulster, and hence by extension Western Norway, which he finds as the best vehicle through which to express not only his approach to art and landscape and nature, which is a combination of a sense of place and childhood recollection and childhood memory, which all get kind of fed into these wonderful scenes of the Ulster landscape and the parsonage and all that sort of thing. But at the same time, he sees it as a way of providing him for a springboard into this wider world.
Mm.
And the fact that Munch not only sees Astrup as the prime example of a Western Norwegian artist, but also says he treats the landscape and he has a sense, his understanding of color, particularly green, is so great that there's no point my becoming a landscape painter. I think that's very relevant because that really seems to say that what's going on in Christiania and Oslo, which is really where Munch's based, he's recognizing that there's a very distinct voice in Astrup, but it's one that he can't do competition with. He has to go on and do his own thing. And I find that fascinating.
But just taking a small departure, or maybe not, it's possible to understand Astrup without using the lens of Munch, which almost everything in Norwegian art history sort of tends to sort of revolve around. But you can put Munch in Christiania and read Astrup as sort of an own history.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think one of my other challenges in certainly taking Astrup abroad was to get him out from under the shadow of Munch.
Yeah.
Munch's shadow is so long. And it's not long, not only during his lifetime, but has continued right the way through. And I think that's really was a challenge. And what I found myself increasingly reminding critics, and also it's in the catalogue, is reminding people that what Astrup is doing is, as it were, an alternative to Munch. And that actually was an interesting point which was picked up by the reviewer of the exhibition in the States at the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, the reviewer of the New Yorker.
Mm-hmm.
Who really, yes, Peter Schattel, who turns out to be of Norwegian origin, which helped, I think. But he really understood that when you're looking at an Astrup, you're not looking at an overtly emotionally charged landscape or figure subject or whatever. Astrup, there's a lot of emotion in it, but it sits underneath the surface. It sort of imbues. It's imbued in what he's painting, but he doesn't allow it to break out in the kind of radical expressionist mode that you have with Munch. And also, it's a point that, interestingly enough, Karl Ove Knausgård picks up in his brief essay on Astrup, which we've included in the catalogue, which comes from his Quartet of Seasons. This is from Winter. It's wonderfully perceptive. He really understands what Astrup is about. And it's marvelous coming from a writer who is also as observant of detail as Astrup is, to have really understood that point.
That brings us over to talking maybe a bit more specific about his work, and how he approaches the painting. And so much of Astrup's painting is almost always based from Jølster as not just a point of departure, but also sort of the ending point of his painting. Can you explain for us a bit how he went about as an artist?
Well, I'll try to, because there is a kind of missing link in all of this. there's one bit of research that I still have to really do more, some more research on, which is really to understand the body of his drawings, what have survived, because he was terribly messy with his drawings. I mean, he just left things lying around in the studio. And I mean, that has its challenges. But I need to understand more the relationship between not just his juvenile drawings, which we can begin to understand, but how he approached, certainly in the early stages of his career, the making of his compositions. He was a photographer, and he talks about using photography to capture a motif in the notebooks that he kept from 1898 to 1908. Very important sources of information of the sorts of motifs that he was finding in the landscape as he was walking around the landscape or looking out of the window of the parsonage that he thought might make a good subject for a painting in the future. And often he will say, I must go and draw that, but also use the apparat, which he often, or it shortens to APPT. And that is where he borrows a camera from a friend. And so we know he's taking photographs. He also seems to have set up scenes to photograph. So he has a kind of artistic photographic, a pictorial photographic sensibility, as well as just using photography as a record, which of course was commonplace by 1900. I mean, artists from the 1850s onwards had been doing that. But once I think you move into the period of printmaking, which starts in 1904, but particularly with the later stage, post-1914, where he's making this crossover between painting and print. And you find him making a painting, which he then turns into a print, as you have with Millingweather. Absolutely the same scale. In fact, it's on the cover of the catalogue. I suspect, although we haven't yet found it, that he probably did a tracing of the painting, turns it, reverses it, and, no, actually, sorry, puts it straight onto the block the same way, cuts through it to give himself the outline for the wood block. He then gouges it out, carves it, prints it in color, and prints it on paper. And of course, it turns out to be the reverse, because that's the nature of the printing process. He then, surprisingly, he makes a sequence of prints, and he then paints a painting. Now, what is interesting is the painting is much larger than either the early painting of 1903-5 and the prints. Now, what process does he go through to get from a print this size to a painting that size? And that I haven't cracked yet. He may have used photography. He may have used a squaring system, where he would put a grid and then he'd work up. But the interesting thing about the painting of about 1920 is it's so fresh and vigorous that it doesn't look as if it's been done on a squared up system. So that's a puzzle. On the other hand, we have a reverse process where absolutely the print is being used as the basis for a painting. There is Midsummer Eve Bonfire, which starts off as a black and white and color print. Examples of each are in the exhibition. And if you take, and then a painting. Now, it's frequently was said, oh, the painting came first and he did the prints. He did the prints. He then takes the block and inks the key plate, the key block, and puts it onto the painting. And the painting, if you draw a line from the same size as the print onto the painting, I wouldn't do it on the painting, of course, but on a reproduction, it's identical. So he was using the print as his sketch, his underdrawing for the painting. So there we do have evidence of a creative process which is going from one to the other. But as I say, in relation to the early creative process, we need to understand more, I think, and the drawings ought to open up that understanding.
But thinking about, you said that he makes sketches, taking photos, but Astrup famously made his own garden at the Astrup, at Astrup-utstillingen in Ulster. What was this need to sort of create the scenes in real life before actually painting them?
That becomes part of a wider European project. You find a number of artists from Monet, Giverny onwards, and Monet is basically making his garden at Giverny from 1885 onwards, but he really starts painting it in seriously, in earnest, from the second half of the 1890s, with the views of the alleys of flowers, then the Japanese bridge, and then of course the water lilies. And what he is doing, which is absolutely identical to Astrup, maybe I should turn it the other way around, what Astrup is doing, which is similar to Monet, is that he's controlling his motifs in order to experiment with the degree to which he can remove the motif away from being a representation to something which becomes a vehicle for his modernist agenda. And it is identical to what you find in Monet, and also in artists like Emil Nolde at Zeebull, and actually at the other previous two gardens that Nolde had. What you find Max Liebermann doing at Wannsee outside Berlin, where he laid out his garden almost at the same time as Astrup. It's 1911 to 1913. And then he does alterations during the course of the subsequent 2 decades. Or you find the Spanish artist Sorolla doing in his wonderful villa that he constructs in Madrid, with a garden around somewhat moresque in its feeling, but in order to paint it. And so there is this sense that the artist has to have control over the motif, because that's what he's using as his experimental bed in some ways. And again, this is where it takes Astrup out of a Norwegian setting and takes him into this international context. And I think that that's what makes Astrup so important, because it is an artist's garden, not just for enjoyment, for somebody to paint every now and then because it's a nice motif, but because it's really part of this creative process.
So through this conversation, I understand that we have an artist who is based in a fairly remote area in Norway, but still is very much part of an international dialogue at the time. It's just the motifs which are sort of being foreign to most, but very much in dialogue with what's going on.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that if we've done nothing else with Astrup, with this exhibition and the catalogue that comes with it, whether you're treating him as a printmaker in J. Clarke's essay, or whether you're treating him as a maker of place with childhood memories and associations, which is what Frances Carey addresses in her essay, gives it very much an international standing. And I hope it's what I've also tried to do, both with tackling Astrup and also talking about Astrup's evolution as an artist, taking him out of this Norwegian straitjacket, if you like, and saying, no, we've got to open the window out into the wider world, because that's where he belongs. And the very fact that he was recognized by the first generation of neo-romantic artists, Verenschold, Kitty Kieland, Harriet Backer, Eilif Pettersen, Gerhard Munter, as being the leading figure of the next generation of major Norwegian artists, along with Harald Solberg. That was the only other, Solberg, that was the other person mentioned, and included in exhibitions of modern Norwegian art that went, for example, to Copenhagen, to the avant-garde exhibition body, the Utstillingen, in Copenhagen, in 1906, is an indication that he was already being seen as something that belonged to a wider context. And that goes for the fact that he's included in international exhibitions in 1911, 1912. He should have been at the Venice Biennale in 1907, but he just didn't get his act together. That's very Astrup. Just somehow was a bit disconnected. But it was Gerhard Munter who was the coordinator for the Norwegian component of the Nordic pavilion in the Venice Biennale that year. And he was invited by Gerhard Munter. Astrup was invited by Gerhard Munter to be part of that. And likewise, again, he should have been in the major Cologne exhibition of 1912, which was if you're trying to get a cross-section of what was happening in contemporary European art, around about 1910, 1912, it was that exhibition which basically gave you a window onto the range of what was being offered across Europe at the time, including from Picasso to Kirchner to Kandinsky to Matisse. It was all there. And Astrup was invited to be part of that, but he was moving house. So he didn't go.
So his international recognition might have been fumbled away, as it were, by moving house or not getting his act together.
It might have got in the way a little bit.
Well, ending on a lighter note, as it were, we're bringing Astrup back to Bergen. I mean, we've taken all his major pieces, or many of them, away from our audience now for quite some time.
Yes.
But we are bringing Astrup back, or you are bringing Astrup back to offer a new perspective on Astrup. So for those of us who are, fairly familiar with Astrup, give us 2 paintings we should go back and have another look at.
Right. Well, first of all, I apologize for having taken so many away, but you've got an awful lot of very good ones. And going back to almost my opening remarks, since quality control was absolutely essential right the way through, along with also looking for works that had not been seen before or very rarely seen, often sitting in private collections. I wished to get them out, to put them in, to give them the context of the very important holdings that you have in Bergen, both from the point of view of what Rasmus Meyer was collecting, now the Rasmus Meyer Museum, and also in terms of the Sparbankstiftelsen DNB long-term loan to Kode. And I should say thank you for allowing Astrup to come back to Bergen, because that was nice and for me very important. But just on that note of, are there a couple of works which really should be looked at hard? Yes, there's one that's coming back to Bergen for the first time since probably round about 1916, 1918. It was a painting that was in the Rasmus Meyer collection, but wasn't part of what became the donation to the city of Bergen to create the Rasmus Meyer gallery here, which is now incorporated into what was the Bergen Art Gallery and now is Kode. It's a painting of the parsonage, painted in 1909. It's in the first gallery. You can't miss it. When you enter, turn left, and it's straight in front of you. It's a painting that actually you discovered, which was very exciting. I went to see it, slightly suspicious, not certain whether it was going to be top draw, and at that time I didn't know it had been the Rasmus Meyer collection, and had I known that, I would never have doubted its quality, because Rasmus Meyer bought very, very well. Astrup complained about that because he never paid the right prices, but you always knocked him down in price, but he bought very, very well, with the intention of building, a major collection of Norwegian art. So one understands that. But there is this painting. It didn't come, as I say, to the Rasmus Meyer Museum or Gallery when it was opened in 1924. It stayed in the family collection. We have one record of it hanging on the wall a photograph of the interior of the apartment of Rasmus Meyer's son's apartment in Oslo, but that's it. And as far as we know, was never exhibited again, has no exhibition history, it has no visual record, and then suddenly it pops up in a private collection, and then the photograph of the Rasmus Meyer's son apartment emerged, and we put the two together. And so Tove Haugsbø, obviously running the Astrup Research Center, and I suddenly sort of went, ping, that's the Rasmus Meyer painting. And that is wonderful that it can come back to Bergen. It seems like it's coming home. And the other painting, just because it normally hangs actually in a government office rather than on the walls of the National Museum in Oslo, is called Spring in Jolster. It's in the Sandalstrand Gallery, which is the grey gallery as opposed to the green gallery. And it is a remarkable painting insofar as it seems to me to summarize the whole of Astrup's program. It's a celebration of Jolster. It's a celebration of everything that he had achieved at Sandalstrand, because it was made probably in 1926, so only 2 years before he died. It's a statement about his sculpting the landscape, conserving the buildings, bringing old buildings up onto the site to provide accommodation for his 8 children. He had a large family. And also, it's a celebration of the fact that he was making a farm, which was highly productive, fed his 8 children apart from anything else, with cultivation plots in the foreground. It's also a celebration of his absolute joy and pleasure of the arrival of spring, because dead center is an apple tree in blossom. It's wonderful. And he writes frequently about the importance of flowering apple and flowering bird cherries and how this is harbingers of spring, along with rhubarb, which grows early, and it's growing in the foreground. And so that's very important. But it also is a statement, I think, about national identity. It's a celebration of a Western Norwegian landscape, and Western Norway was seen as the heartland, and if you like, the symbolic center for Norwegianness. During the course of the 19th century, when Norway is seeking its own national voice in terms of things cultural, so in literature, in music with Grieg, and in art with the neo-romantics in particular, but coming out of Tiedemann, Gouda, and Dahl, of course, but it's moving into another phase. And so the fact that it is of Jolster, I think, is part and parcel of that story, but particularly so because something I only noticed recently. On the lower right-hand side, he's celebrating the stone grotto that he made, his bit of landscape gardening, and immediately below it is a waterfall and a little bridge and then a cascade. And on either side, there are quite big grey boulders. And it's as if you'd shrunk the Western Norwegian landscape into a little micro landscape. And yet it is Western Norway. And so in a sense, it has that national agenda. And I think that that's because Astrup saw that as part of his exercise. He's not only conserving buildings, but he's also conserving plants. Plants which are local, that are being threatened by modern agriculture. So he is a conservationist. He is an environmentalist. He's concerned with sustaining the community and his own family. And he's also about the fact that in the process, he's making a statement about national identity. But at the same time, it's very strange from a compositional point of view and from a perspectival point of view and from the handling of paint and the palette. It's very modern. It's breaking all the representational rules of naturalism. And in that sense, I think it's also very much a statement about where he thought he was going with his own art, as his own path for modernism. So, and it's back here.
So being both a man of his time, he's also a painter for this time, with sustainability, with conservation, with nature, about being sort of homebound as well.
absolutely. I think it's totally part of the story. And the fact that he was doing this in 1920, there weren't many others who were as concerned as he was across this wide range of concerns. He even reports on glaciers shrinking. That's pretty early to be concerned with about glaciers shrinking. But he's there. He notices it. And I think that goes back to the fact that he has an incredible eye. His ability to record detail, whether it's in a drawing or whether it's in words, because he was an amazing wordsmith. He understood the use of words and the use of the importance of words, of finding exactly the right word to describe what he is looking at. And many artists find that very difficult. But he had this ability. So when he's surveying the landscape, and it's made up of a myriad of greens because it's been pouring with rain, he has a particular word to describe each of those greens. They're all different. And it's up to 12 if you go through his writing. So that's that ability. And I think it's that observation that allows him to be concerned about conservation and so on, because he sees it disappearing and he knows he has to do something about it.
So for everyone out there, go and see Astrup and his amazing work, both from his time and in our time. Thank you so much, MaryAnne, for spending time with me and sharing of your huge knowledge about Astrup and for making this possible.
Well, thank you very much for hosting the exhibition and for putting the Astrup Research Centre at my disposition. It's been wonderful and a very good partnership. And I would like to think that it will then lead to further things.
Let's hope so. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.